4:17 a.m. The sky's pitch black, but my 3 acres of sugarcane glow orange like caramel lava, swallowing my grandfather's legacy. Sweet burnt sugar, diesel, and rage choke the air. Barefoot in dew, phone shaking, I watch 3 generations curl into black ash. Then I spot her. Lululemon pants, North Face vest, messy bun like post-Pilates glow. Empty gas can in hand, she douses the rose like basting 4th of July ribs. Match flares, flame drops. She pumps her fist, quick victory flex, then jogs back to her gated cul-de-sac like trash day done. She thought torching that ugly farm would boost property values and snag her HOA crown. No clue the wind would shift. No clue dry cane would roar, leap the fence, melt power lines. 20 minutes later, lights out, AC dead, Wi-Fi gone, ring cams blind. Panic floods her precious group chat. She handed me the match that burned her empire, live for the whole neighborhood to see. What would you do if someone torched your family's blood and sweat? On camera? My name is Garrett Tulloch. My grandfather, Elwood Tulloch, came to central Louisiana from sharecropping roots in Mississippi, saved every dollar he made cutting timber, and in 1961 bought 8 acres of bottomland just outside a small town called Crestfield. Nobody thought much of the land then. It was marshy, stubborn, and hard to work. Elwood thought it was perfect. He planted sugarcane, not as some romantic notion, as a survival strategy. Sugarcane in Louisiana is practically a currency. It's dense, drought-resistant once established, and the sugar mills will buy every stalk you can grow. Elwood handed that land to Garrett Sr., who handed it to me, and for 37 years I've been farming those 8 acres the same way my grandfather did. Methodically, stubbornly, and with a deep and abiding suspicion of anyone who tries to tell me what I can do on my own property. Which is how I ended up in the crosshairs of Darlene Whitlock. Now, I want you to understand something about Crestfield in 2019. The town had been changing. A developer named Holloway Group had been quietly buying up land on the western edge of town and building what they called a lifestyle community, which is a fancy way of saying a subdivision full of 3-car garages and people who'd never owned a lawnmower before purchasing a riding one purely for aesthetics. They built a homeowners association, naturally, and they elected Darlene Whitlock as its president, naturally. Darlene was a retired regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, which tells you everything you need to know about her management style. She was precise, relentless, aggressive about metrics, and genuinely believed that authority was a personality trait she'd been born with. She drove a pearl-white Lexus SUV so clean, it looked like it had never touched an actual road. She had a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws in her glove compartment. I know this because she once showed it to me, as if it were a weapon. Here's the thing. My family's land didn't belong to the HOA. We weren't in the subdivision. We were adjacent. Our eastern fence line ran along the back border of the new development. Legally, geographically, and in every way that mattered, we were separate entities. Darlene did not agree with that assessment. Her first move came in the spring of that year. She sent me a certified letter. Not a note, not a knock on the door, a certified letter, informing me that my sugarcane field was aesthetically inconsistent with community standards, and that the agricultural odor produced during harvest season was a nuisance to HOA residents. She demanded I install an 8-foot privacy fence along the full length of our shared property line, roughly 400 feet of fencing, at my own expense, within 60 days. The smell she was referring to, by the way, is the smell of cut sugar cane and the faint diesel tang from the harvesting equipment. It smells like Louisiana. It smells like work. It smells like my grandfather's hands. I didn't build the fence. She filed a nuisance complaint with the county. The county, to its credit, reviewed the complaint, noted that sugarcane farming was a legally protected agricultural use of land under Louisiana's Right to Farm Act, and dismissed it within 3 weeks. That should have been the end of it. If you've ever dealt with someone like Darlene Whitlock, you already know. That was just the warm-up. She started showing up at county commission meetings. She organized a petition, 73 signatures from subdivision residents, demanding that the county rezone my land from agricultural to residential. She contacted local news stations, suggesting my equipment was a public hazard. She filed noise complaints about my irrigation pump. She called the State Department of Environmental Quality with anonymous tips about runoff issues. Every single complaint was investigated, Every single one was dismissed. The crunch of her Lexus tires on the gravel county road became the sound I associated with incoming paperwork. I started keeping a folder, a thick one. By the summer of that year, Darlene had shifted tactics. The nuisance complaints weren't working, so she went upstream. She started attending every single Crestfield Town Council meeting. Front row, center seat, a legal pad full of notes and the kind of focused energy that makes local politicians deeply uncomfortable. She pushed for a new municipal ordinance, the Agricultural Buffer Zone Ordinance, which would require any working farm within a half-mile of a residential development to maintain a 100-foot cleared buffer between their agricultural operations and the nearest fence line. If that ordinance passed, I'd lose roughly 40% of my workable acreage. 40%. We're talking about the difference between a profitable farm and one that bleeds money. What made it clever, and I'll give her this, she was clever, was that she'd framed it entirely in the language of fire safety. The summer of 2019 had been dry. There'd been a grass fire 2 counties over that made the local news. Darlene stood up at that town council podium and said, with complete seriousness and a laminated printout of the news story, that my sugarcane field was a wildfire waiting to happen, and that the HOA community had a right to protect itself. Now, here's what she didn't say, what she carefully omitted, was that sugarcane fields in Louisiana are routinely burned. It's called a controlled burn, or field firing, and it's one of the oldest and most regulated agricultural practices in the state. Farmers burn their fields before harvest to remove the leafy chaff from the cane stalks, making mechanical harvesting easier and reducing pest habitat. It's legal. It's licensed. It requires notification to the state fire marshal. I'd been doing it for 20 years without incident. But she stood up there and talked about wildfire risk and let the council imagine whatever they wanted. I didn't find out about the proposed ordinance until my neighbor Beaumont Oaks, Beau, who ran a small crawfish operation a mile down the road and had been watching Darlene's campaign against me with increasing alarm, texted me a photo of the agenda from the town council's website at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The council meeting was Thursday. I had 40 hours. I called the LSU Ag Center Extension office first thing Wednesday morning. I want to be clear about something here, because this is genuinely useful information. Your county agricultural extension office is one of the most underutilized resources in rural America. These are professionals whose entire job is to support working farmers, and they have the data, the regulatory knowledge, and frankly the institutional credibility to walk into a government meeting and speak with authority. They also have standing. A county extension agent testifying about agricultural best practices carries 10 times the weight of a farmer defending himself. The agent assigned to our parish, a methodical man named Fielding Arsenault, pulled every record of my licensed burn permits, my compliance history with the state fire marshal, and 3 separate studies from the LSU Agricultural School on controlled burn safety practices in residential adjacent farming zones. He had a packet ready by Wednesday afternoon. I showed up Thursday night with Beau, Fielding Arsenault, and 3 other farmers from the area who'd heard what was happening and weren't about to let a subdivision HOA start setting agricultural policy for the whole county. Darlene was already there, front row, legal pad. The ordinance didn't pass that night. We had enough voices in the room to give the council pause. But here's where the mini twist landed. Commissioner Dale Pruitt, who'd been on the council for 11 years and was generally considered a reasonable man, kept finding procedural reasons to table a final vote rather than kill the ordinance outright. He wanted to study it further. He wanted a working committee. Beau pulled me aside after the meeting in the parking lot, gravel crunching under our boots, and said 2 words: Pruitt's brother-in-law. His brother-in-law, as I discovered the next morning with about 45 minutes of public records research on the parish website, was on the board of the Holloway Group, the same developer who'd built Darlene's subdivision. I added that to the folder, and I started keeping a second folder. It took Darlene about 3 weeks to find a new angle, and when she did, I had to admit, with genuine, teeth-gritting reluctance, that it was a good one. She contacted my crop insurance provider. Crop insurance, for those who've never farmed, it's not optional. It's the financial lifeline that keeps a working farm solvent through bad weather, bad harvests, market swings. My policy was through a USDA Risk Management Agency program, federally backed, state administered, and it covered the sugarcane crop against fire loss, among other things. It was, in a word, essential. Darlene sent a letter to the insurance company's regional office. She identified herself as the president of a neighboring homeowners association, expressed concern about the fire risk my field posed to the surrounding community, and attached, here's the part that made my jaw actually drop, a letter she'd solicited from a private fire consultant she'd hired, a man named Trent Blaylock, who had apparently assessed my property from the road and concluded that my field represented an elevated fire hazard due to proximity to residential structures and insufficient fire breaks. Trent Blaylock, I later confirmed, had a website, a logo, and approximately 4 Google reviews, 2 of which appeared to have been written by someone using a very similar writing style to his own bio. But the insurance company didn't know that. What they knew was that a formal, professional-looking letter had arrived questioning the risk profile of my policy. They opened a review. They sent an adjuster. They put my policy on a status hold, which meant that if anything happened to the crop while the review was pending, I might not be covered. It was August. Harvest season was 8 weeks away. I don't mind telling you that for about 48 hours, I was scared. Not angry, scared. Because if that crop wasn't covered and something went wrong, we were looking at a 6-figure loss with no safety net. My wife, Rhonda, who has a considerably cooler head than I do, and a master's degree in business administration she has never once used to underestimate an opponent, sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "Garrett, stop reacting and start building a case." She was right. She usually is. I called an agricultural attorney in Baton Rouge named Winston Guidry. Winston had been practicing farm law for 22 years and had the particular calm of a man who had seen every flavor of rural dispute and found most of them mildly amusing. He told me 3 things in our first phone call, all of which I want you to hear clearly. 1. Filing a bad faith complaint with an insurance provider for the purpose of financially harming a competitor or neighbor can constitute tortious interference. 1-sentence takeaway. If someone deliberately tries to damage your business relationship with an insurer using false or misleading information, that's potentially a civil lawsuit waiting to happen. 2. Any written communication Darlene had sent to my insurance company was now a legal document, and I had the right to request a copy of it through the insurer's appeals process. 3. And this was the one that made me sit up straight. Before we did anything else, he wanted me to pull the full recorded covenants, conditions, and restrictions filed by the Holloway Group when they established the HOA, the original legal documents. Because in his experience, HOAs that spent a lot of energy enforcing rules on outsiders very frequently had skeletons buried in their own filings. It took Winston's paralegal about 4 hours to pull and review the documents. She called back that afternoon. The HOA's own covenants included a provision, Covenant 14, Section 3, if you want to look up how common this is, requiring the developer to maintain a transitional landscaping buffer of not less than 50 feet along any property line adjacent to agricultural land for the duration of the development's existence. That buffer was supposed to consist of mature trees, maintained hedgerow, or equivalent natural screening. The buffer Holloway Group had actually installed along our shared fence line, 8 feet of ornamental grasses and a wooden rail fence. They were in violation of their own founding covenant, had been since the day the subdivision opened. I called Winston back and told him what I was thinking. He said, very quietly, "That's a pretty good hand, Garrett." I said, "I haven't played it yet." He said, "No, but now you know you have it." Word travels fast in a small town, and the word that Garrett Tulloch had retained an attorney reached Darlene Whitlock within, I'd estimate, 72 hours of me signing the retainer agreement. I know this because within that same 72 hours, my farm's name appeared in the Crestfield Community Facebook group for the first time. The post was from a woman named Sherry, neighbor of Darlene's, based on her profile photo, which showed her standing in front of a house I recognized, asking whether other residents had noticed the chemical smell coming from the farm to the west, and whether anyone else was concerned about their children's respiratory health. Now, my farm does not produce chemical smells. We use standard fertilizers in standard quantities, all permitted, all within regulatory limits. The smell that occasionally drifted toward the subdivision during certain wind conditions was, as I've said, the smell of cut cane, or, during burning season, wood smoke. It was not, by any reasonable definition, a health hazard, but the post got 47 comments in 2 hours. Darlene organized what she called a community safety forum at the HOA's clubhouse the following Saturday morning. She did not invite me. She did not notify me. She did, however, post about it extensively on the Facebook group, where she described my farm as a source of ongoing environmental concerns and suggested residents document any smells or smoke they experienced and submit reports to both the parish health department and the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. What she'd done was crowdsource a complaint campaign. I only found out about the meeting because Bo Oakes drove by the clubhouse on his way to get diesel and counted about 30 cars in the parking lot. He called me from a gas station, and I could hear the pump running in the background. "Garrett," he said, "she's got a whole room in there. I don't know what she's telling them, but it ain't good." Here's what I did not do. I did not show up at the clubhouse. I did not post anything on Facebook. I did not call the newspaper in a panic. What I did do was call Marisol Vega. Marisol was a reporter for the Acadiana Courier, a regional paper that covered 5 parishes and had a solid reputation for agricultural stories. She'd done a piece on the crawfish industry 2 years earlier that Bo had recommended to me. I called her, explained the situation in about 10 minutes, and asked if she'd be interested in touring the farm before harvest season and writing a piece about sugarcane farming in the parish. She came out the next Wednesday. I want to paint you a picture of that morning, because I want you to understand what Marisol saw when she arrived. She pulled up in a Subaru with a notepad on her passenger seat, and I met her at the gate at 7 a.m. The air smelled like damp earth and the faint sweetness of the cane. That's a real thing. Sugarcane has a mild natural sweetness you can smell when it's mature, and the morning is cool and damp. The stalks were about 12 feet tall by then, dense and green, swaying a little in a light breeze off the bayou. My equipment, 2 aging but immaculately maintained John Deere pieces, was parked in the equipment shed with the doors open. Everything was clean, everything was labeled. Every permit, every license, every regulatory approval was in a binder I handed her, along with a cup of coffee and a piece of pecan praline my wife had made the night before. Marisol spent 3 hours on the property. She took photographs, she reviewed the permits. She noted, on the record, that the farm showed no signs of the violations or hazards Darlene's group had alleged. Meanwhile, Winston Guidry filed a formal written complaint with the Holloway Group's registered agent, required by Louisiana law before any covenant enforcement action, citing Covenant 14, Section 3, and documenting with photographs and measurements the inadequate transitional buffer along our shared fence line. He gave them 30 days to respond. The response came in 17 days. A letter from the Holloway Group's attorney stating that the company disputed the interpretation of the covenant language and considered the matter not actionable. Winston read me that letter over the phone in about 15 seconds, then said, "Great, now we can sue them." He sounded almost cheerful about it. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late September, about 3 weeks before harvest. A number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. The voice on the other end was a man named Conrad Shetler. He lived in the subdivision, had bought one of the original units when Holloway Group opened the development 4 years earlier. He was 61 years old, recently retired from a career in commercial insurance, and he had been quietly watching Darlene Whitlock's war against my farm with a growing sense of unease that had recently tipped over into something more active. "Mr. Tulloch," he said, "I think you need to see the HOA's financials." Conrad had been on the HOA's Architectural Review Committee for 2 years, a volunteer role that gave him access to certain HOA meeting minutes, but not the full financial records. What had caught his attention were the special assessment line items. Special assessments are a legitimate HOA tool. When an unexpected expense arises that exceeds the reserve fund, the HOA can assess all homeowners a one-time fee to cover it. Conrad had counted 14 special assessments over 3 years. He'd done some rough math. The total collected from residents was approximately $340,000. He then looked at the HOA's disclosed expenses over that same period. Roads, landscaping, clubhouse repairs, insurance. Everything documented and reasonable. The math didn't add up. There was roughly $180,000 that went somewhere. Conrad, being a man who'd spent a career looking at financial documents, had filed a formal request under Louisiana's nonprofit disclosure law. Most HOAs are incorporated as nonprofits, which means their financial records are subject to state disclosure requirements. The HOA had stalled. Then they'd sent partial records. Then Darlene had personally called Conrad and told him, in what he described as a very controlled but not friendly tone, that his committee access was under review. He'd gotten a lawyer. His lawyer had gotten the records. And buried in the records, this is the part that made the hair on my arms stand up, were quarterly payments to a company called Crestfield Property Consulting, LLC. About $12,000 per quarter. $12,000 every 3 months, for 3 years. Crestfield Property Consulting LLC had one registered member. You want to guess? Dale Pruitt's brother-in-law. The same man who sat on the board of the Holloway Group, the developer. The HOA was paying a shell company connected to the very developer who'd built the subdivision. And the developer's representative was the man who kept finding reasons to table the town council ordinance that would benefit the subdivision. It was a circle, a neat, greedy, small-town circle. Here's what that means in legal terms, because this is important. Homeowners associations are fiduciaries to their members, which means the board has a legal duty to manage association funds in the members' best interest. Using HOA funds to pay a company with undisclosed connections to the developer who controlled the HOA's founding documents is a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. In some configurations, particularly if the payments were made in exchange for favorable treatment, it could rise to fraud. Takeaway: HOA boards have fiduciary duties to their members, and undisclosed financial relationships with connected parties are potentially illegal under both state nonprofit law and common law fraud standards. Conrad Shetler was not looking to be a hero. He was a retired insurance man who was offended by bad math and worse ethics. But he just handed me something I hadn't had before. I wasn't just defending my farm anymore. I was holding a grenade. We met at my kitchen table on a Sunday in early October, 6 days before I planned to start harvest. Rhonda made a pot of red beans that filled the house with the smell of smoked sausage and bay leaves. There was a yellow legal pad at the center of the table. By the end of the afternoon, it had 4 pages of notes on it, most of them in Winston Guidry's tidy, deliberate handwriting. Here's what we built. The first piece was legal, and it had 2 tracks running simultaneously. Track 1, Winston's existing covenant violation lawsuit against Holloway Group. That was already filed and moving. Track 2, Conrad's fiduciary breach claim against the HOA board. Conrad's attorney and Winston were going to coordinate so that the discovery process in both cases would overlap, which meant that subpoenas in one case would produce documents useful in the other. This is a real tactic in multi-party civil litigation. You use parallel discovery to build a more complete picture than either case could produce alone. The legal term is sometimes called coordinated discovery, and when it's done right, it's extraordinarily effective at exposing financial misconduct. Takeaway: filing parallel lawsuits in connected disputes allows coordinated discovery, which can expose financial misconduct that a single case might miss. The second piece was financial. Winston sent a formal demand letter to Darlene Whitlock personally, not to the HOA, to Darlene, citing the insurance complaint she'd filed, the consultant she'd hired, and the documented dismissal of every prior complaint she'd submitted. The letter laid out the elements of a tortious interference claim, a valid business relationship, my crop insurance policy, Darlene's intentional interference with that relationship, the false consultant letter, and resulting damages, the policy suspension, and the cost of the appeals process. We attached itemized records. We gave her 30 days to respond. I want to be honest about what I was and wasn't feeling when Winston read me that letter. I wasn't triumphant. I was tired. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from spending a year defending something that should never have needed defending in the first place, and it settles into your shoulders and your sleep. Rhonda put her hand on my arm when Winston finished reading, and I didn't say anything for a minute, and neither did she. Then Bo said, "What about the burn?" And here's where the plan got, let's say, elegant. Louisiana farm burn permits are filed with the Louisiana Department of Agriculture and Forestry. They require advance notice, typically 5 to 7 days, and they specify the date, time, and acreage. They are public records. Once filed, they are legitimate, legal, and essentially unstoppable by any private party. My 2019 harvest burn had always been scheduled for mid-October. I'd been doing it in mid-October for 20 years. What I did, with some careful attention to the calendar, was file the permit for the Saturday of the HOA's annual Fall Festival. The Fall Festival was an outdoor event. Tents set up in the common area behind the clubhouse, food vendors, a bouncy castle based on the Facebook event Sherry had posted. Darlene was on the organizing committee, naturally. Now, I want to be crystal clear about this because I'm aware of how it sounds. A legal, licensed, properly permitted controlled burn of a sugarcane field produces a substantial and legitimate amount of smoke. Not toxic, not dangerous at the distance between my field and the subdivision's common area, but notable, visible, aromatic, and entirely my legal right. Meanwhile, Bo and a few other farmers started making phone calls. Not to media, not to lawyers, to HOA homeowners. Just neighbors talking to neighbors, passing along information. Did you know you have the right under Louisiana law to demand a full financial accounting from your HOA? Did you know there's a disclosure process? Did you know you can ask to see where that special assessment money went? We weren't organizing a revolt. We were sharing public information. But information, once loose in a small town, has a way of finding exactly the people who need it most. By the Thursday before Harvest Week, Conrad told me he'd heard from 11 other HOA residents who'd retained attorneys or were planning to file their own disclosure demands. Marisol was taking notes on all of it. Darlene found out about the burn permit date on the Tuesday before the Fall Festival. I don't know exactly how, probably through someone at the parish office, but the speed with which she mobilized was, in a grudging way, impressive. Within 24 hours, she had called the Louisiana office of the state fire marshal, submitted a written objection to my permit on the grounds of proximity risk to a high-density residential gathering, and CC'd both of her state legislators. The fire marshal's office takes burn permit objections seriously. They are required to. They sent a field inspector to my property on Wednesday morning. I met him at the gate with the same binder I'd shown Marisol. Permits, licenses, 20 years of burn records, the State Agricultural Extension Office's written assessment of my compliance history, and a hand-drawn map of the property, showing the distances between the burn zone and the subdivision's fence line. The distance was approximately 340 feet at the nearest point. Louisiana regulations require a minimum of 100 feet of clearance from structures. I had 3.5 times the required distance. The inspector walked the property for about an hour. He checked the wind direction projections for Saturday. He noted that the subdivision common area, where the Fall Festival was planned, was on the northern side of the HOA property, which put it roughly 500 feet from the edge of my field. He filled out his report, handed me a copy, and told me my permit was valid and that the objection had been reviewed and denied. He did this in a way that suggested he dealt with permit objection campaigns before and found them, on the whole, not particularly complicated. I called Winston from the driveway while the inspector's truck was still pulling away. Winston said, "Good, now document that call." Meanwhile, Bo called me Thursday evening. He'd been approached at his own gate, which took a particular kind of nerve, by a man who identified himself as working for the Holloway Group and asked whether Bo might be willing to provide a written statement supporting the HOA's fire safety concerns in exchange for consideration regarding any future land acquisition discussions. Bo, who is 64 years old and has been farming crawfish in central Louisiana his entire adult life, looked at this man for a long moment and then said, "Son, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'm going to tell you to get off my property, and then I'm going to call Garrett Tulloch." He called me at 7:15 p.m. I could hear the bayou frogs starting up in the background. A second farmer, Calvin Theriot, who ran a small cattle operation on the other side of my property, had received a similar approach. Calvin had not been polite about it either. Both Bo and Calvin wrote up what had happened and had their accounts notarized. Winston added them to the file, noting that what had been described was potentially witness tampering and, given the connection to pending litigation, potentially contempt. "Are we going to file on that?" I asked. "Not yet," Winston said. "Let them keep going. Every move they make is another exhibit." That weekend, Darlene posted on the Crestfield Community Facebook group that the Fall Festival would proceed as planned and that she was personally committed to ensuring the safety and comfort of our community. The post had a photo of the decorated tent, strings of lights, long folding tables with checkered tablecloths, a banner that said, Crestfield HOA Fall Festival, celebrating our community. She'd posted it at 11 p.m. At 11:15, she posted a follow-up. If you smell smoke Saturday, please know we are doing everything we can. The comment section was a thing to behold. I will give Darlene Whitlock this. She did not quit. Other people, smarter people, or at least people with better lawyers, would have looked at the file growing against them and found a dignified way to disengage. Darlene did not disengage. She doubled down with the focused intensity of a woman who had built her entire identity around never being wrong in public. On the Friday before the fall festival, 20 hours before my burn permit was valid, Commissioner Dale Pruitt called an emergency session of the parish council. The stated purpose was to consider a temporary public safety declaration regarding open burning events adjacent to residential gatherings. If the declaration passed, it could theoretically provide grounds to suspend my permit pending further review. I heard about it at 8 a.m. Friday through a text from Marisol, who'd been monitoring the council's agenda page. The session was scheduled for 2 p.m. I called Winston at 8:02. Winston Guidry, bless that man, had apparently anticipated something like this. He had, on his own initiative, prepared a draft emergency injunction the previous week, a legal motion that could be filed in district court on short notice to block governmental action that violated due process. Due process, in this context, meant the right to adequate notice before a government body takes action that affects your legal rights. An emergency council session called with 6 hours' notice to consider a resolution targeting a specific individual's existing permit was, Winston argued in his filing, a textbook due process violation. He filed the injunction at 10:15 a.m. The district court clerk called the council at noon. The council's attorney, who had not been consulted before Pruitt called the emergency session, called Pruitt at 12:30. The emergency session was canceled at 1 p.m. But here's the thing about a canceled meeting. People who showed up for it still show up. Rhonda had spent Thursday evening making phone calls. She knew 4 women in the HOA subdivision, not Darlene's inner circle, but residents who'd been quietly furious about the special assessments since Conrad's disclosure requests had started making their way through the neighborhood grapevine. Rhonda didn't ask them to do anything dramatic. She simply mentioned that there was going to be a council meeting Friday afternoon, where the HOA's political connections would be on display, and that it might be worth seeing in person. 3 of them came. They sat in the council chamber at 1:50 p.m. and discovered the meeting had been canceled. They were standing in the parking lot when Darlene arrived at 1:55 in her pearl-white Lexus. What happened next was not something anyone planned, but it was, in the words of one of the women who was there, a long time coming. Darlene got out of her car and saw the 3 women standing there, and immediately understood that something had gone wrong. Her composure, that particular laminated document composure she'd maintained for a year and a half, cracked. Not dramatically, not in a screaming way, but visibly. Her jaw tightened. Her voice, when she spoke, had a jagged edge that nobody who'd only seen her in HOA meetings had ever heard before. She said, "Who told you about this?" One of the women, her name was Peggy, she was 63, she'd been a school principal before retiring, looked at Darlene for a long moment and said, "We're homeowners, Darlene. We're entitled to attend public meetings. This meeting has been canceled. We can see that. You should go home." "We're standing in a public parking lot," Peggy said. "We're fine." Marisol was there. She had a notepad. She was not, technically, covering the canceled meeting. She was just in the area. Darlene looked at Marisol's notepad. She looked at the 3 women. She looked at the council building. She got back in her Lexus. She sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I know because Marisol timed it. Then she drove away. Tomorrow was Saturday. Tomorrow was the burn. And tomorrow, though nobody had planned this part, nobody could have planned this part, was the day Darlene Whitlock decided to take matters into her own hands in a way that would change everything. Saturday, October 12th, 5:57 a.m. I was at the edge of the north field with my burn equipment when I found the fence. Our shared fence line, a 5-wire agricultural fence I'd maintained for 15 years, had been cut. Not broken, not damaged by weather or equipment. Cut. 3 wires, cleanly snipped at the post closest to the corner of the property, leaving a gap about 4 feet wide. I stood there for a moment in the dark, the air cool and still smelling of dew and turned earth, looking at the cut wires. Then I took out my phone and called Winston. "Don't touch it," he said immediately. "Photograph everything, exact timestamp on every photo. Then call the sheriff's office non-emergency line." I photographed the fence from 6 angles. I called the sheriff's office. I noted the time, 6:03 a.m. Then I walked the fence line south for about 80 feet, because something didn't feel right, and that's when I smelled it. Not cane, not dew, something sharper, chemical. The unmistakable petroleum bite of accelerant, a smell I know from 20 years of managing burns, the smell of something that wants to catch fast and run hot. Someone had sprayed the base of the cane along the fence line, a strip maybe 60 feet long, wet and glistening in the early light. I photographed that too, and I called the fire marshal's office, and I called Marisol. And then I sat down on the tailgate of my truck and waited, because there was nothing else to do, and because I had a permit and a clean record, and I had called every authority I could think of before lighting a single match. At 7:20, the Crestfield Fire Department arrived. At 7:35, so did the state fire marshal's investigator, the same man who'd approved my permit 3 days earlier. I did not conduct my burn that morning. The investigator requested I hold until their preliminary assessment was complete. What happened next took about 2 hours to fully unfold, but I'll give you the condensed version because the facts speak with extraordinary clarity. The accelerant was identified as a commercially available charcoal lighter fluid, the kind sold in every hardware store in America. The cut fence wires had clean, consistent edges, consistent with wire cutters or diagonal pliers. A partial boot print in the soft soil near the fence post was photographed and cast, and a half-empty bottle of lighter fluid was found 15 feet inside the cut fence, on my property, in the grass. Someone had cut my fence, entered my property before dawn, doused the cane with accelerant, and left a container behind. The intent, as the fire marshal investigator later described it in his report, appeared to be to make any fire that occurred appear to have started on my property from my burn, but to burn hotter and faster and more unpredictably than a licensed controlled burn ever would. What that person had apparently not accounted for, or had miscalculated, was the topography. The back line of the HOA subdivision ran alongside a utility easement. The power lines serving the eastern half of the subdivision ran on poles along that easement, roughly 40 feet above the ground, and approximately 90 feet from the cane field. When the accelerant-soaked cane caught, from a source the investigation later determined was not my burn equipment, it burned with considerably more intensity than a standard field fire. The heat column rose fast, not high enough to directly ignite the power lines, but high enough, combined with the thermal updraft, to melt the insulation on the lower distribution line at 2 points. The lines arced. A transformer at the corner pole failed. The eastern half of the subdivision lost power. The fall festival, already set up in the common area, went dark at 8:47 a.m. Darlene was standing at the check-in table when the power died, in a cable-knit sweater with a name tag that said, "Festival Chair," surrounded by her neighbors, when 2 sheriff's deputies and the fire marshal's investigator walked across the grass toward her. The boot print from my fence line matched the boots she was wearing. The wire cutters were in the cargo area of her Lexus, which a deputy spotted through the window when he walked by. She was arrested for criminal trespass, criminal damage to property, and arson, a 3rd-degree arson charge, given the extent of the resulting damage, in the Crestfield HOA Fall Festival common area, in front of approximately 60 of her neighbors, while a string of lights swung gently in the breeze overhead, connected to nothing. Marisol got the photograph. It ran on the Acadiana Courier's website within the hour. The criminal case against Darlene Whitlock resolved 8 months later with a guilty plea to criminal damage to property and a lesser arson charge. She received 3 years of probation, paid $47,000 in restitution, which covered my fence, the accelerant damage to the field edge, and a portion of the utility company's costs for the downed lines, and was permanently banned from serving in any HOA board capacity in Louisiana under the terms of her plea agreement. Her attorney had argued for complete dismissal on the grounds that the damage was unintentional. The prosecutor had photographs of the wire cutters in her car. The plea agreement was, in Winston's dry assessment, reasonable for everyone involved. Commissioner Dale Pruitt did not seek re-election. The relationship between his brother-in-law's company and the HOA's special assessment payments became public record during the civil discovery process, and the resulting story, which Marisol wrote across 3 features in the Acadiana Courier, won a Louisiana Press Association award for investigative reporting. The Holloway Group settled Conrad Shetler's fiduciary breach suit for $210,000, which was distributed back to HOA homeowners as remediation of the improper special assessments. Crestfield Property Consulting LLC dissolved within 30 days of the story running. The covenant violation lawsuit settled separately. Holloway Group agreed to install a proper 50-foot transitional buffer along our shared property line. Mature cypress trees, as it turned out, which are both beautiful and ecologically appropriate for the region, and to pay my legal fees. Winston called that one a clean win. My crop insurance claim for the damaged cane edge was paid without dispute. The insurance company, upon reviewing the full file, including the fire marshal's determination that the accelerant had been placed by a third party, also issued a formal letter withdrawing any adverse notation from my policy record. They also, separately, declined to renew any future policies for businesses associated with Trent Blaylock, the 4 Google review fire consultant. I'm told this from a source and cannot verify it officially, but I believe it. The field was replanted that following spring. If you've never watched a sugarcane field come back after a fire, even a partial one, I want to tell you something. Sugarcane is a ratoon crop, which means it regenerates from the root system. You don't always have to replant from scratch. The root structure my grandfather put in the ground 60-something years ago pushed up new shoots that spring, green and determined, in the same dark soil, under the same Louisiana sky. There's a metaphor in there. I'll let you find it. Conrad Shetler became the interim HOA president after Darlene's resignation. He restructured the board's financial reporting, established a homeowner audit committee, and instituted a policy requiring all vendor contracts above $500 to be disclosed at open meetings. He sent me a Christmas card that December. It had a picture of his grandkids on it. Bo came over for the first harvest of the new season, and we sat on the tailgate of my truck at the edge of the field in the late afternoon, drinking sweet tea that had gone a little warm, watching the cane move in the breeze. The smell was everything it always was, earth and sweetness, and a little diesel from the equipment shed. Louisiana in October. In my grandfather's name, I established the Elwood Tulloch Agricultural Scholarship, a $2,500 annual award for graduating seniors from our parish who plan to study agriculture or environmental science. The first recipient was a 17-year-old named Jasper Fontenot, from a farm family 3 miles down the road. He's studying agronomy at LSU. Elwood would have liked that.
You know what I keep coming back to? The boots. She drove to a man's camp at 4 in the morning, cut his pants, dosed 3 generations of sugarcane with lighter fluid, and wore the same boots to her own fall festival 6 hours later. That's not cowardice, that's arrogant. That's what happens when someone's been the most powerful person in every HOA meeting for so long, they forget the rest of the world has eyes. Darlene walked out of that festival in handcuffs in front of 60 neighbors she had spent 3 years trying to impress. The Holloway Group cut a $210,000 check back to the homeowner she'd been quietly bleeding dry, and the $47,000 restitution she owned Garrett out of her own pocket. Garrett didn't celebrate. He just went back to his field and watched the cane push up through the same soil his grandfather broke in 1961. Some things survive people like Darlene. Most things do, actually, if you read the photo ready. How many of you are sitting inside of an HOA right now, running the exact same playbook? Special assessment nobody can explain. Board members with contractor handshakes nobody's supposed to notice. Drop it in the comments. If this one hits close to home, try it. Somebody you know needs to see it. And subscribe because the next story is already waiting. The smallest authority is always the most dangerous because it never believes it can lose.